All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning for what to look for when you look at art. We're going to learn the basic principles of how to approach, analyze, and appreciate great works of art the way an artist would. Included are discussions on viewing art as both a physical object and the expression of an idea, art in the context of its time, and the elements of composition. And I know Gene here has like an 8-hour class on this, and he's condensed it all to 1 hour for us. And Gene is going to introduce himself. Before that, I did want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation for co-sponsoring this morning's program. So all 200 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Gene for joining us this morning. And Gene, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hi there, everybody. Welcome to New Jersey. If you're coming from out of state, don't forget to wipe your feet. We're going to talk today, as Robert said, about looking at art, just some general ground rules. First, let me introduce myself. Hit the little arrow here. This is the book I wrote, The Art of Looking at Art. It came out a couple of years ago. It's a compendium about everything having to do with art. I'm not going to rattle on about it because you can find it all over the internet. But more importantly, this is my contact information. If you'd like to send me any comments or questions or anything of that nature, be on my mailing list, Gene@GeneWisniewski.com, which is how I prefer to have it pronounced. And this is my website with my name also, where you can find my work. And the6hourartmajor.com is where you can find a list of my upcoming classes. So without any further ado, let's get started with a talk about how some general guidelines, this is the basic art looking experience. You're sitting there in front of a painting. What do I do? What do I look for? The first thing is a real cliche. Don't look, see. Really take the time to observe. A lot of people spend, on the average, 30 seconds looking at a work of art, and there is so much to look at. A good work of art keeps giving and giving and giving the longer you look at it. So there's always something to see in it. They actually are sending a lot of medical students to museums to have them look at paintings and analyze them in an attempt to make them more sympathetic toward their patients, and also to increase their powers of observation so they get better at diagnosing diseases. And there's a lot of fringe benefits to learning how to look at art or making art yourself. Don't be afraid to take an art class, if you can, and just, even if you don't want to do it, there's so many benefits to be derived from it. So having said that, one thing I want to say is that very often, if you go to a huge art show, like a big retrospective, where there's 150 paintings by one artist or something like that, it can be a little overwhelming. So what I always suggest doing in that case is kind of looking through the whole show to get an overall view of what the theme is, because usually art shows are centered around some kind of theme, or check out the chronology, or, take in the whole show first and then focus in on the hits, because there's usually a couple of, famous pieces in there. And then take the time to look at the things that you noticed, that you caught your eye that maybe aren't the greatest hits by that artist, and just take a little time to look at them. When it comes to guides, audio guides or docents, these people really know their stuff, the people who give guides or tours in museums, but they do have a danger in that you might listen to what they have to say and just kind of move on. Okay, got it. I don't have to look at this any further. So while they can supply you a lot of really fascinating information, they do limit the experience a little bit. Plus, they'll skip like 4 paintings that maybe you wanted to look at. So don't just rely on audio tours. There is something to be said for seeing artwork alone. You can get absorbed in it in a way you just can't when your friend is saying, like, I'm really tired of looking at this one. Can we move on to the next one? I remember once going to the National Gallery in London and spending 3 hours in front of one painting. Now, I don't expect anybody but an artist to do that, but take some time. And there is something to be said for seeing art alone for the absorption factor. There is a phenomenon in the theater called the willing suspension of disbelief. That is where you go to a theatrical production or go see a movie and you just kind of accept it as real. This is happening. It's the same idea with a painting or a sculpture or any work of art. put yourself in it. Just like when you open up a book and start reading a short story, accept the premise of the story and just go with it. I'm a little too gesticular here. I'm knocking my computer around. So, just kind of get into it and pretend that it is its own little world, because that's what it is. An artwork is self-contained, just like a movie or a short story. It all is there in front of you, but it doesn't really unfold in that it doesn't tell a story. So what you have in front of you is the whole thing, and you're looking at the picture as one entire thing and its own little world. I also suggest asking a couple of offbeat questions when you first see a piece, like, what might I call this artwork if I didn't call it the thing that the artist called it? If this painting had a soundtrack, what would it be? How are the people in this artwork like me, and how are they different? And most important, I think, what is their world like? What was the time they were living in like? How does this painting relate to the time that it came from? Because that's my personal view on artwork, is it really is like fashion or the music people are listening to. It's a time capsule, and it says something about the time. And a lot of art is universal because human behavior essentially doesn't change. So an artwork from hundreds of years ago can relate to our own present day, and we're going to have a really good example of that later on in the lecture. Think of a couple of adjectives right off the bat. Try to avoid judgmental ones like god awful or stupid. Just big bold red. If that's what comes to your mind, just go with that. It's the same way you kind of size up people. When you look at them, you get an immediate impression, and go with that and just see where it takes you from there. Look at the artwork from up close and from far away, because that's how the artist made it. See how all the details relate to each other, and then hone in to look at little details. And we'll get an idea of that later too. Realize that you cannot know everything there is to know about art. It's a huge subject, and I am always learning. There's always new art being made to learn about. So realize that you cannot know them all. And the last thing I'm going to say is just remember that the art you like tends to say as much about you as it does about the artwork that you're looking at. There's certain reasons that you're drawn to certain types of artwork. So now we're going to get down to a little more nitty gritty. The first thing we're going to talk about is the difference between classical and modern art. Back in the old days, before the 19th century, art was made at the bequest of a wealthy patron, some religious figure, a pope, a cardinal, a duke, a king, an empress. Somebody like that ordered the work to be made according to their specifications. They had a theme in mind, and making art wasn't really much different from hiring a high-end decorator, to do your house. Artists were thought of basically as craftspeople, mostly craftsmen back in the old days, but that's another story. So art was really not considered art in the way we think of it now. It was meant to either aggrandize the patron, or to push a religious agenda, or to keep the powers that be in power. And it was made for this wealthy class. Very few common people saw art, except maybe when museums started to open in the 1800s, when museums started coming around, or they would see public art, or they would see church art. But most of the art that was made was stowed away in a castle somewhere for the noble or the king's own enjoyment. Let's see. Yeah, up until the Renaissance, actually, up until the end of the Middle Ages, maybe around the 12th century, artists really were craftsmen. They belonged to guilds, which were very, very much like work study programs or work unions. And they worked themselves up the rank, just like plumbers or electricians. As a matter of fact, the terms apprentice, journeyman, and master, which are used for electricians and plumbers nowadays, were applied to artists at one time. Those were the ranks you worked up your way through. You started as an apprentice, sweeping floors and mixing paints. Then you would work yourself up to a journeyman who might travel around, but usually worked on the background and, or secondary figures in a painting, but worked under the auspices of a master artist. Then, if you were a journeyman and you did a work that was put before the guild and they thought it was good enough, you were allowed to open your own shop and become a master artist. That's where the term masterpiece actually comes from. But then around the Renaissance in the 1400s, with all the great geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, they were such singular geniuses and accomplished such great works that artists started going to art academies, which meant that rather than getting a blue-collar education as craftsmen, they went to college and studied a liberal arts kind of education. But this is a perfect example of a classical painting based on the myth of Narcissus and Echo. And you see it revolves around certain themes. Academies told you what you were supposed to paint. There were certain hierarchies of genres. Paintings like this, religious scenes, big battles, the stuff you'd see in a Cecil B. DeMille movie, that was at the top. Portraits were kind of lower down on the scale. Stuff like still lifes and landscapes were way down on the scale. And very often women did paintings like that, like little genre paintings, because they were not allowed to study at the academies and learn how to do these great history paintings. I'm sure there's some questions by now. Hopefully I'm not going at too quick of a pace. Let me know if I am, or put something in the chat maybe.
Gene, you're doing great.
Okay, raise your hand if I'm going too quick or anything like that. So this is a painting from 1849 by Gustave Courbet. And this is a huge painting of road workers. Now, the thing about this painting, we take it for granted nowadays because it's just a painting of some road workers. But back in the 1800s, this was considered unacceptable subject material for artwork. So even back in the early, mid-19th century, the idea of, is this really art, was around. Art was supposed to be about elevated stuff, Hercules and big battles and religious scenes and saints and portraits of nobles. And a painting like this in the mid-1800s of just plain common road work, laboring away with ripped clothes, was considered totally unacceptable as a topic for art. So that's also just to show that this question goes way back. What actually caused modern art in my book was the French Revolution. Because once the French Revolution happened and the monarchy was overthrown, the French Academy started to take artists who weren't necessarily Academy members. So anybody who called themselves an artist could, apply to be in these salon shows that the Academy gave every year or every 2 years. But you didn't have to necessarily be an Academy member anymore. So that also opened up the subject material of art and what art could be about. So this is the beginning of modern art, is when the French Academy started allowing anybody to be considered an artist. There was a jury system in place to make sure that it didn't get too liberal, but this is one of the basic ideas of where modern art came from. And we're going to go into that a little further as we go down the road. Another thing to consider when you look at artwork is the time and the culture. The Pietà is a typical subject material in Christian art, in Roman Catholic art. The Virgin Mary holding the body of a dead Christ. The most famous one is Michelangelo's. But if you look at these two Pietàs from different time periods and different countries, you can see that it really reflects the culture. They've taken the same subject of Mary holding Jesus's body, and you can see that the one on the left from a Polish abbey in Eastern Europe is a lot more bloody, a lot more graphic. Eastern Europe did not really experience the Renaissance, that great, revival of classical learning that happened in the 14 and 1500s. They kind of stayed in the Middle Ages. And then thanks to Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, they kind of joined the Baroque era. So they kind of fast forwarded into modern times. And you can see this Pietà here reflects kind of a more Middle Ages kind of sensibility. It's real graphic. You can really see Jesus's sufferings. The wounds are actually three-dimensional. They're carved in, so the blood has a thickness to it. Whereas in the Michelangelo piece, it just shows a whole shift in the attitude toward religion. It's almost like the one on the left is trying to show you how Christ suffered for you and, to make you kind of beat your breast and feel guilty. Whereas in the one by Michelangelo, it's almost like the salvation has already been achieved because it's a whole different mindset about religion that occurred in the Renaissance. So you can really see how the aesthetic changed because of the country and the time that the same subject was made in. So that's another way that art helps you understand the time and vice versa. Next, as we talked about everything there. Now we're going to talk about a very famous painting by Johannes Vermeer called The Milkmaid. And this is just to show you that just because you recognize everything in an artwork doesn't necessarily mean you understand it. Clearly, there's a maid in a kitchen pouring milk into a bowl, probably to make some kind of bread pudding or bread casserole for the family for dinner. But there is a hidden story behind this. You know, people think this is this really meditative, very domestic kind of painting, where she's just kind of there doing her household duties and it's very quiet. But there's some details you may not realize. First of all, this was made as a result of the Protestant Reformation. Remember what I said, in Europe, generally, up until modern times, art was all about religion and big themes and gods and things like that. But in the northern part of Europe, after the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, they wanted more of a direct relationship with God, and paintings of people with halos and saints and that kind of thing went totally out of fashion in the north of Europe, like starting in the 1500s and going all the way up to the 1700s. So they wanted different paintings. All the stuff that was looked down upon in the south of Europe, like these genre paintings of common everyday subjects, still lifes, landscapes, that's what they wanted in the north of Europe. So if we look at a little detail here, we can see in the corner of the painting a little box and some tiles. Now, there is a statement being made here in that in those days, a lot of people thought, just like they still kind of think very often, that people of the lower classes have lower morals. So you would see a lot of Dutch master paintings with a maid lying in a barn looking like she'd been hit by a taxi cab, and there's a basket of broken eggs sitting next to her, indicating that she had lost her virginity. And it's kind of, a lot of these paintings are kind of laughing up your sleeve at the lower class. This one is a little more serious, but there is an erotic overtone to this painting. This box here is a foot warmer, and the implication is that she could put it under her skirt and warm up the lower part of her body. Now, that's a symbolism we would totally not get nowadays, but that's kind of what that foot warmer stood for. Also, if you look at the tiles, there's a little Cupid aiming a bow and a man walking here with a knapsack on his back. Barely noticeable details, but that indicates that maybe the maid, while she's pouring her milk, which is also another kind of suggestive symbol, might be thinking about an absent lover. So that goes to show that you really need to know the story about art. You can't just necessarily say, oh, I got it just because you recognize it. Next slide. Let me see, make sure I said, yes, I said everything I want to say there. Okay, now you go to any museum, you'll see tons of these kind of paintings. You're like, oh, good, another noble, another ancestor, somebody else in a wig. But what you have to realize is that in the days before celebrity photography, this is what you had. You had portraits, and these people had their portrait painted because they were famous or well-known or powerful. And, it kind of goes to show, like, anybody would recognize a painting of King Henry VIII because that image is so in our mind, and Henry VIII was so famous. But a lot of people who were less famous or very famous during their time only were also portrayed in these portraits. If you look at this painting, there is a cat here digging into a goldfish bowl trying to acquire lunch. That is a reference to this woman's name. Her name was Kitty Fisher. If you also look at the goldfish bowl, you'll see there's a highlight on the goldfish bowl, and that is a reflection of the window of the room that she's sitting in. And if you look up real close, nobody can see this. I can't even see it on my laptop, but there are people peering in through the window to show that people are curious about Kitty Fisher having her painting done. And why, who is this woman? Well, in Georgian England in the 1700s, early 1800s, this is the time of Jane Austen and things like that. England was very, very class conscious. The class system was very, very established. And Kitty Fisher here was born as a milliner's daughter in a day when, if you were born a milliner's daughter, you were undoubtedly going to die a milliner. which was not a very high-end profession in those days. There was, basically a tailor. But she had higher aspirations for herself. So in a day when women especially had very few chances in a very rigid class system, she decided to become a courtesan and was one of the most renowned women in Georgian England. She actually relates, and this is something I referred to earlier, very well to our own time, because she and a bunch of other courtesans like her in Georgian England were constantly written up in the papers, basically just for being famous. So they really anticipate the Kardashians. And this is when the gossip journalism industry was invented. Men carried images of Kitty Fisher and these other women. There's one in the Met Museum, by the way. Her name was Grace Dalrymple Elliott. And she was another courtesan. She was painted by Joshua Reynolds. But men carried images of these women around in lockets, in their snuff boxes. They were written up in the papers daily for their exploits. One instance where Kitty ate a really big, like $1,000 bill between two slices of bread so she could. Another incident, she got thrown from her horse while she was riding the park. And this story may be apocryphal, but she was thrown from her horse in such a way that it was shown that she wasn't wearing any undergarments. And she thought her career was over because she had gone too far this time, but actually it only increased her reputation and was written about in the papers for months. So she was this very famous woman. She decided at the age of 27 or so to go legit. She was going to marry a member of parliament. And sadly, a year later, she died either of smallpox or maybe from the lead that was in the makeup she wore. So these people have fascinating stories. And somebody like a docent, or maybe if you're reading about Georgian England, you can go to the museum and find the real article. So don't just, throw these portraits away as like, oh yeah, there's another portrait of somebody I don't know. They do have very fascinating stories very often. Here's an example of the story of versus the story behind. This painting was done in 1789, just after the Bastille was stormed. It was presented at the Salon, and it is a reference to ancient Roman history. This painting takes place in the 6th century BC in ancient Rome. The Roman king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was overthrown by his nephew, Lucius Junius Brutus, because Tarquinius Superbus was something of a tyrant. And his nephew overthrew his uncle and established the Roman Republic with 2 other men, and ended the king's despotism. He believed so strongly in the revolution, Brutus did. This is him sitting in the corner here. He believed so strongly in the Roman Republic that when he found out his sons were involved in a plot to restore their uncle to power, he had his own sons executed for treason. And this depicts the moment when his sons' bodies are being brought into his house. So this is Brutus, this is his wife, his daughters, and a maid over here crying into a blanket. Now, this relates very directly to the French Revolution because this was supposed to be exhibited at the Salon before the general public, and King Louis XVI thought the painting was dangerous and decided to ban it. It created such an uproar that it had to be shown at the Salon, so it may have actually helped bring Louis XVI a little bit closer to the guillotine. So the story of the painting takes place in ancient Rome, but it relates to the modern times of the French Revolution. So that's an example where a story of a painting has a greater reverberation because of the time it was produced in. Now, moving on. We're going to talk about the beginnings of abstract art. Now, when I said the French Revolution brought about a change and modern art was created as a result of the French Revolution, this here is a painting from the Romantic era. This is, the late 1700s, early 1800s. While it is the time of Jane Austen, it's also the time of Edgar Allan Poe, the Shelleys. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, Nathaniel Hawthorne. People were enamored of things that were creepy and gothic. And whereas the art of the French Revolution was all about rationality and, the logical thoughts about the rights of man, and people, the architecture was all very neoclassical And despite the fact that it brought about the terror in Paris and thousands of people were killed as enemies of the revolution, the art of the revolution itself was all about trying to recreate rational thought and the idea that the common man had rights just like anybody else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when Romanticism came around, as I said, during the period of Edgar Allan Poe, the Shelleys, all this stuff, people started emphasizing different themes in art. And the whole style of art changed. So the Romantic movement is the first movement to break away from classical art in the early 1800s after the French Revolution. And you can see the difference. And this is the beginning of abstract art, because this is not a real horse. It's not about capturing the way a horse looked like the classical art would have been. It's more about being what a horse looks like in a storm, like the feeling of a horse in a storm, rather than what a horse in a storm actually would look like. It's all about loose brushwork, and it's very actiony. There's a lot of movement in it, and it's more about feeling than about capturing realism. So the brushwork, the kind of abstracted brushwork and the feeling of the painting are the beginnings of modern art with the Romantic movement. And the movement that followed, actually, the Romantic movement was the Realism movement. So that's another example of art breaking away from what was considered the standard of classical ideals, like in the David painting we're looking at. So this is a close-up of the Delacroix painting. We can see, just how loose the brush strokes are and how, emotive the painting is. Now, this is an actual abstract painting by Paul Klee. And it makes a lot of sense when you know the title of it. It's called Park near Lou. Lou meaning Lucerne, the city in Switzerland. And once you know that this painting is called Park near Lou, it clearly becomes a park. You can see the lakes and the grass and the trees and the pathways. Maybe these are figures exercising and having fun in the park. So it kind of reads both ways, but the idea here is to give the feeling of a real thing. So this helps you read the art. Knowing that it's supposed to be a picture of a park helps you understand what the painting is about. And I make a very clear distinction between abstract art and non-representational art. A lot of artists don't do this. Now, this is a little tricky, so I'm going to go a little slower. Abstract art, like this painting by Paul Klee, is all about changing the appearance of a real object. Your cousin George, a park, a landscape, a still life like Picasso did or something. You take a realistic thing and for some reason, you interpret it to look not as real as it did while still capturing the feeling of what the subject was. The reasons for doing this, I use the metaphor it's like having to resort to a foreign phrase because you don't have that word in your own language. So in other words, abstract art is trying to give a feeling you couldn't get if you painted the park more realistically. Like this gives a really happy feeling in a way that another more realistic painting of a park might not. Now, non-representational art, like this painting by Sean Scully, has no subject to it. It's painters like Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, Mark Rothko, Sean Scully is another example, where there is no subject. It's not supposed to be about anything. It's not supposed to tell a story. It's just about the paint itself, about the feeling you get from looking at the painting, the emotion that the colors get from you, but there's no object. And the reason why I describe this as different from looking at abstract art is because you're not supposed to be thinking this is a park. You're just looking at the painting and accepting it for what it is. And when the artist was making it, it was the same idea. They weren't looking at a park and saying, oh, let me interpret this park. They just have a canvas in front of them and they're trying to make the canvas balance and they're trying to make the painting work, but they're not referring to a third party out there somewhere. So that affects not only how the art is made, but how you look at it as well. Now, when people ask me, what is this painting about? I don't really necessarily know what he's trying to say. I look at a lot of his work and I see a lot of it has to do with structures and architecture and things like that. And when I look at this painting, I do see something that looks kind of like a structure, but it's kind of unbalanced. Like if you look at the black could either be a solid, like another brick, a black brick, or it could be an empty space. That's the funny thing about black in a painting. It's so absolute that you don't know necessarily how to read it in something like this. Is it a whole or is it an actual presence? So if you think of it as a whole, none of these quote unquote bricks, and I'm using that term loosely because I'm not saying they are bricks, I'm saying they kind of suggest bricks to me. If you took away those black shapes, the whole structure would fall apart. And the whole thing would be out of balance, like there'd be nothing to support this here. So the idea of is it solid, is it not, is kind of how I read this painting. Now, Sean Scully may be listening and he may leave something in the chat room saying, you're an idiot, you read my work totally wrong, but that's what I get out of it. And that's how I read it, but I'm not necessarily reading it literally as a structure. Hopefully everybody's got that. Now we're going to talk about non-representational art as a gesture. If you look at the Sean Scully painting, there is movement in it. It does tie together. You know, there's a little black here, a little black there, a little black in the middle, but it's very solid. If you look at the Jackson Pollock painting, this is full of movement and your eyes want to dart all over the canvas, but there is a rhythm to it. It's a huge painting. Jackson Pollock's paintings tend to be big. If you want to see a picture of him working, you can go on YouTube. There's actually footage of him doing a painting on a piece of glass to show how he did these works. He used the canvas was flat on the floor. He used house paint rather than artist paint. He flung the paint at the canvas rather than brushing it on or let it drip from sticks. This was a whole new way of painting. And the idea of painting from border to border without any, central thing to look at was a whole new idea as well. But you can see the movement here. And if you look at him working, you can see, that he kind of dances around the canvas when he's making his work. And he lays down one color at a time and he creates a rhythm. And then he lays another color on top of it. And the whole thing is full of rhythms that bring your eye all around the canvas. This is a detail of one of his canvases. You can just see how many layers there are of paint and how much there is to look at in one of his paintings. And this is, once again, how he went about doing them. I would really recommend watching the YouTube video because it's kind of interesting. But in his paintings, the idea is all about just the movement of the paint itself and the gesture, what they call the gesture of putting down the paint. Like this is, you can see the artist's hand in the painting. You can look at it just like if somebody puts "wash me" on the back of a dirty windshield, or if you see footprints in the snow, you get a message from it that somebody moved here. Somebody wrote "wash me" in the dirt on the window, and you can tell they used the end of their finger. It's the same thing when you look at brush strokes, and we're going to talk about that in the next section here. This is another classical painting by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, who is something of a contemporary of David, who we looked at earlier. And this is the kind of stuff that just wows people when you look at the details. You can see it's so photographic and so detailed, and people wonder how it was done. When you look at a painting like this, you have to realize that this is a very, very long process, this kind of classical painting style. You do a painting, an underpainting, and then you put thin glazes, very transparent layers of paint over the underpainting to color it in. So it's almost like colorizing a black and white photograph, except a lot slower, because you may put down 20, 30, 40 layers of paint, all of which are transparent, to build up the color over essentially a black and white painting or slightly tinted painting. So this is a very time-consuming procedure, but you don't see any brush strokes, so you have to picture almost like mopping a floor, a very smooth kind of motion that the artist made with their hand to kind of color in all these little tiny shapes. Sometimes maybe the paint is a little thicker, but you can see that it's very detailed and it's not this big sweeping kind of movement. Then we look at a painting by Frans Hals, who's a 17th century painter from Holland, who's a contemporary of Rembrandt. And painters like that are the ones who invented what was called direct painting. If you look at a detail of the hand, you can see it's done with very few strokes. It's not every little detail. This was a very revolutionary idea at the time in the 1700s, 17th century. But this is called direct painting, where you don't apply layer after layer after layer. You kind of just attack the canvas and you put down the paint and kind of smush it around a lot. And this is a lot more gesture oriented, a lot more action oriented as well. But you can see how amazing it is how he just caught this hand. And it's hard to tell, even if you look at the details, like it's hard to even think of this as a finger because it's so weird looking. So this is once again another beginning of abstract art, the idea that paint itself could say something, that you can feel the artist's presence in the paint strokes and tell how they applied them. Let me just make sure I'm not leaving anything out. No. This is a Mark Rothko painting, a non-representational painting. And this is all about mood, these kind of hovering rectangles that you can really kind of get into. Once you look at it, you focus on them, it turns into its own little world once again. And this painting is all about just establishing a mood. But even if you look at a detail of this, it's not just purple and black. If you look up here, you see there's some orange, there's a little bit of green here, there's some red here. There's some purple down here, green down here. So you can see when you look up close at the painting, how many layers of paint are built up to make, to give the rectangles that kind of hovering feeling that they have, to make them feel like they're floating. There's layers and layers and layers of paint involved. Next thing I want to talk about how important it is to see artwork in person, because you don't really get an idea of anything until you're there with it. Also, this demonstrates how different people can have a different experience with the same work of art. I went to a show of Rob Terrian's work of big furniture, and I got in a conversation with the guy who was at the gallery. And in my view, I felt very humbled and very little, almost like a pet or like a small kid crawling under a table. He, on the other hand, felt like he said it made him feel awesome, like he was in some land of giants, like he'd landed in some magic kingdom somewhere. So maybe that says something about me as a person, him as a person, but it does give you the idea of how different people can take away different ideas from the same artwork, but it does also emphasize, hey, you just can't get the idea of scale or what it really feels like, or those brush strokes I was talking about, unless you go see the artwork in person. Another thing is the artwork engaged with you? Art is from the same word as artisan, which means a working person, a skilled craftsman, but it also is the same source of the word artificial. Paintings are artificial, just like plays are. They're an artifice. Artemisia Gentileschi is not, just in her studio painting away, painting herself. She had a body double probably for the body, and then she glued her own head on top of it. But it gives the idea that you're just kind of glancing at this scene that's just sort of happening in front of you, but it's not. It's all artifice, and it's very, very posed. And we're going to talk about posing and composition and all that stuff as we go on. Now, this is a painting that's very aware of you. He's looking back at you after 350 years, and apparently he doesn't have a very high opinion of us, but he was a very high noble in the Spanish court. It's thought that he was a cousin of Diego Velázquez, but he's looking back right at us, and he's engaging with us in a way that Artemisia Gentileschi is not. He knows he's being painted, and he's staring us right back in the eye. Now we're going to talk about composition, and composition is basically the layout of a painting, the way it's arranged. Excuse me one second. Composition is a word that's also used in music. There's a lot of terminologies that music and art have in common, like tone, harmony, rhythm, and composition is one of them. Like I said before, a painting is self-contained. If you look at these words composition, you see they're all different sizes and colors, and I purposely balance this slide very carefully so that your eye goes all over the place. You go from one to the other, and we're going to talk about that shortly too. You also see that some seem to come forward, like this dark black one, whereas the gray one, which is smaller and lighter, tends to fade back more. So there's not only it's not only tied together around the canvas, your eye goes from here to here to here to here, it's also a space of in and out, which is totally fake because the painting is flat. And we're going to talk about that too. This is an example in a painting of what I was just talking about, the idea of unity being achieved by repetition and then variety, so it's worth the trip. So here you see a repetition of these squares here and here. There's lots of circles, but everything is kind of different. You have these verticals here that all tie together across. Then you have a horizontal bar here to tie it all together. This threatens to go up the canvas, but then on the other side, it stops short of the canvas. These circles could be in front of the black bar, on it, or next to it. It's not sure where these circles are in space, and they're all different. And that's what I mean by variety. So you have two curved pointy shapes here, and that's where the unity is, but the variety is making one yellow and one red. Then you have red here, red here, red here, black here, black here. So you see how it all ties together. Even the fact that this canvas gets lighter down here, if you notice, is a very slight gradient. It's darker up here and lighter down here. If this were just as dark as it is up here, the whole painting would fall apart because you really need this lightness down here to bring your eye down into this corner. So that is the theory I'm talking about of composition with variety and unity. This is an example of how the composition can add to the plot. Once again, you see the repetition of the stripes, the feathers, a lot of triangles in this painting. There's triangles here, there's three heads, three hands, triangle here, but the most important triangle is right in here. You see there's an arm, a stripe, and a shadow. And within that triangle is a hand. And even though they're not really close, his hand is appearance-wise anyway, really close to his knife. So it gives the idea that if this guy gets the idea he's being suckered at cards, that he's going to wind up in the river somewhere. So in this case, the triangle and the composition itself is adding to the plot. This hand and knife are almost in a frame. And even here, you need this little vertical down here to bring your eye down to this corner. And you see the color here is pretty much an echo of the color up here. So that's what ties this corner and this corner together. If you didn't have this little stack of chips down here, whatever that is to mix the dice, I guess whatever they're playing, I don't know. That's a backgammon board. So I guess you put dice in there. I don't know how to play backgammon. But if you didn't have that down there, the whole painting would fall apart. Your eye would be all right heavy. So that's how compositions are balanced. Now we're going to talk about focal points. You see there is one white flower here in this painting by Van Gogh. Some people have actually ventured that this might be a self-portrait. Maybe it's a stretch, but it is the center of attention, this white iris here. First of all, because it's the only white thing in the whole painting, except for a little white up here and some white over here that kind of accents the white. Like I said, the white is distributed around the canvas. But this is like a parade of purple irises, and he's almost, I'm assuming he or she, I don't know what gender irises are, but is like the band, what do you call that? The master of ceremonies or whoever leads a band. They're at the head of this procession of purple irises. Also down here, this batch of irises is literally pointing right at it. You also notice that the white iris is at the dividing line between the yellow and the purple flowers. So that gives it a very important spot. So these are all the things that make that white flower the focal point of the painting. And your question is, why is that white iris the focal point of the painting? What is he trying to say here? Does it make a statement even? Or is it just for its own sake? Did he just like it? Now, here's an example of what's called hierarchy, where you have several focal points. This is a descent from the cross where Jesus's body is being deposed from the cross after he dies. The main spotlight is on him. Ostensibly, it's being offered by a little lantern down here, but the lantern clearly isn't strong enough to cast that kind of light. So this light is almost theatrical. And then there's a secondary light on Mary, his mother, fainting into the arms of some strangers. And down here, in a third darker light, there are women preparing the shroud for Christ's burial. So it shows you, a hierarchy of look at this first, look at this second, and look at this third. And it's almost an interpretation of the painting by itself by accentuating these different focal points. A painting doesn't have to have a focal point like Jackson Pollock. There's no focal point. The painting goes all over the place. Now we're going to talk about what's called the elements of art. And this is pretty much where we finish up. We have about 10 minutes left. I think we'll barely make it. I'll talk fast. The elements of art are like the elements of music, melody, harmony, rhythm, all that stuff. It is what art is made of. The first one is space. Now, space in a sculpture is real because a statue really is three-dimensional, but in a painting, it's all fake. This is a very shallow sense of space. Jan van der Plurg is a contemporary Dutch artist who paints right on the wall. Don't get much flatter than that, but even still, it has a sense of movement to it. It has a sense of back and forth because is it white on black or black on white? So even though it's totally painted on the wall and is about as shallow a space as you can possibly get, it does have a sense of depth to it. Also, these things seem to be going kind of backwards into space. So there's a lot more to even a very simple minimalist painting like this than you think. This painting, on the other hand, has a very deep sense of space. This is a view of the Piazza San Marco in Venice, but it would take you a good 45 minutes or an hour to walk across this painting. But once again, the sense of space is all an illusion. It's just a piece of cloth. So it's kind of amazing when you think about the sense of space you can get on a piece of cloth. And that's one of the main issues of a painting is what am I going to do with the idea that the painting is flat and the world is not flat? Well, some people think it is, but the sense of space is not there. There is a sense of depth in in the real world that's not on a canvas. Am I going to acknowledge it or am I going to ignore it? Now, this is the idea of positive and negative space. Everybody knows about the two faces in a vase thing. Is it two profiles or is it a vase? And that plays with the idea of what is the positive space that is the subject of the picture, as opposed to the negative space, which is what's behind or between, the main subject. So the positive space is the vase of flowers in the still life. The negative space is everything behind it. But the negative space is also the space between the flowers. Anything that's not the main subject. I could talk about the negative space between my nose and my upper lip. It's the space between things. And a painting like this by Max Bill, really, by the way, he was an architect, a Swiss architect. This really gives you an idea of what's in front, what's negative and what's positive space. You notice it's all slightly off balance and a little uncomfortable, but in a very pleasing kind of way. And you might also notice that at some point, and this plays into maybe him being an architect, is that these corners kind of want to flap up and make it almost look like you're looking up at the ceiling. So it has a lot more going on than you might think it does, but it's an idea, once again, of positive and negative space. Here's another example of the same thing. Once you start honing in on the negative space and what's not the main subject and really look at paintings up close, you see a lot of interesting little details. You can focus in on these peasants having their lunch, taking a break from their work harvesting. This painting by Peter Bruegel is called The Harvesters. It's once again a Northern European example of common everyday genre painting. But, once you look up close, these people are just doing people things. They lived 500 years ago, and you look at their faces and they're real people. And there's something very, very poignant about people just doing their people stuff. Even though they've been dead for 500 years, they are individual people. Another thing you notice when you start looking at this painting is finding out about the times. This is one very little section of the negative space. I mean, you see also gold, green, gold, silver. This little yellow here is necessary to bring your eye back there. These people in this one little area of the painting way back here are playing a game called Squale, which consists of throwing sticks at a dead goose hanging from a pole. I guess they didn't have video games, they didn't have Netflix, so this is what they did for amusement. But you can see all the little details of daily life that are included in this painting by looking at the negative space, what isn't the main subject, and it shows the rewards of looking at artwork for a length of time. Now, are you going to know about Squale? Of course you're not, but you can ask somebody or look it up, get an analysis of the painting. What are the people in the background of the painting doing? Well, they're playing Squale. This is another idea of space. We are going to run a little over, I think, actually. I'm trying to talk as quick as I can and get this idea across, but I've been talking too much. Frank Stella makes what he calls painted wall sculptures that you see are very huge. And this is half a painting and half a sculpture. Meanwhile, you have Lucio Fontana here, who slashed his canvases, which is kind of a transgressive act, seems kind of violent, has to be done very carefully because he wants the slashes to be in just the right place. But besides destroying the painting as a possibility for a realistic painting, he actually also makes the painting into kind of a sculpture because the canvas now kind of puckers in or out. So what used to be a flat surface is now kind of three-dimensional with these very carefully placed slashes. So you see a painting doesn't necessarily have to be absolutely flat. This is a current artist named El Anatsui from Ghana, who makes these huge kind of sculptures or paintings or wall hangings or draperies or big enough to hang on the side of a building out of products that come from the West. He will take strips of metal cut from evaporated milk cans or caps from liquor bottles imported from the West and make these huge kind of hangings that can be arranged in different ways. A really interesting way to play with space, and also making a commentary about colonialism by, featuring these products from the Western world that are imported into Africa. Scale and proportion. This is another two components of art. Scale is to do with size, like comparative size. A basketball is bigger than an orange. The Grand Canyon is very large. We're going to look at some examples of that. Proportion is size within something, like the average human body is about 7 heads tall, or how much whiskey do you have compared to how much soda when I make my drink. So this is an example of how scale shows space. Even though these are two equally black circles, it seems that this one might be coming a little forward because it's bigger, but clearly this shows a difference in scale. This is bigger than this. This is bigger than this, which makes a very kind of amusing statement in this painting. What exactly is this artist trying to say by making the little chick so big? And the farmer kind of just distractedly looking off into space, totally ignoring the fact that he's standing in front of an enormous baby chicken. So this is how scale can make a statement. Very often scale is also used to indicate importance, like in Egyptian art or medieval art. The Virgin Mary and Jesus are bigger than everybody else because they're more important. This is an example of scale. Klaus Oldenburg and his partner Kuscher von Bruggen made these enormous sculptures of very common everyday things. This spoon holding a cherry is actually a bridge, and it shows a common everyday thing in a whole new light by making it enormous. So scale, once again, making a statement about reconsidering things. Now, this is an example of proportion. Yoshitomo Nara is a contemporary Japanese artist, and he does these very big paintings of very little kids, and they always look really angry. And his rationale for the paintings is the kids are so defenseless that they really do need to put on these airs to protect themselves because they are so defenseless. And so they look very angry and very aggressive all the time. And he's trying to make a statement about how helpless children really are and how defiant they have to look to compensate. Edges are another aspect of another component of art, one of the elements of composition. And edges define space. When things have sharp edges and there's a lot of contrast between dark and light, things tend to come forward. If things are grayed out and fuzzy, they tend to go backwards. And this is a very psychological painting by Kay Sage, a surrealist artist who committed suicide at the age of 56, I believe. And I really do think this painting demonstrates her isolation very well, but the sense of space is very ambiguous. This could be going back forever or ever and ever. This might just be a stage set. It could be very shallow, or it could be very, very deep. The fact that there's no horizon and you don't know how far back this painting is really kind of disconcerting, as well as these kind of fabric-looking things encaged in these structures of some sort, which are apparently very huge. So this feeling of space and disconcertation, is that a word? Of discomfort is very apparent by giving this uncertain sense of space by manipulating the edges of the objects in the painting. Line does not really exist, but it's probably the most immediate thing in art. You need a pencil and your hand. Early cave paintings were not paintings, they were drawings that were colored in. And this is where you really get the feeling of what I was calling the gesture before, where you really can feel the artist. Egon Schiele's line is very aggressive, very bold, and you get a real different feeling from his line than you do from, say, David Hockney's. Now, when you look at Cy Twombly's line, this is from his Blackboard series. These paintings are very, very big. And once again, you have to think about the energy involved in making these strokes. You'll be able to go, it's just a bunch of scribbles, but there's really a lot more work going on here than you think there is. And there's a lot more to manipulate than you think there is as well. And it's all about feeling the energy of making these big strokes. When you look at the painting, another reason to see the artwork in person. Now, color is the most emotional part of art. Chances are, if you don't like the colors in a painting, you're not going to like anything else about it, but it really is very expressive, and it's the first thing you notice. You can see the difference between a painting by a German expressionist painter, Ludwig Kirchner, and what a feeling that has compared to a painting like this, which has a very subdued color scheme. Now, this is to introduce you to another terminology. Monochromatic means that something is based in one color. In this case, green. Mark Wagner is a contemporary collage artist who makes his collages out of cut-up dollar bills. This is from his George Washington at Large series. It's called Rub-a-Dub. And in this series, he shows George Washington, who is Mr. Dollar Bill when you think about it, and kind of really represents America both as a country and as a monetary entity, doing all kinds of stuff. In one collage, he's a lion tamer. Another one, he's mowing his lawn with a power mower. So it kind of shows George Washington in these kind of different situations, all made out of collages, monochromatic collages made from money. This is an achromatic painting. It looks like it's just black. Now, there's lots of black and white paintings as well in the world, and I'm not going to explain every black painting or every white painting. I'm going to explain this one, and I'm going to show you a digitally enhanced version of this painting. Tilt your monitor so you don't have a glare and stare at this painting while I'm talking. Okay, this painting is not black. It's 3 shades of black. It is a greenish black, a bluish black, and a reddish black. You see the red in the corners, the green across the middle, and the blue up here and here. Now, these 3 colors are the way the human eye perceives color. We see color as red, blue, and green in our eyes. That's the color cones in our eyes. And you've heard probably of RGB printing scheme, or, that's how color is presented on a monitor. We interpret those basic 3 colors, red, blue, and green, and get all other colors from that. But as you stare at this painting, you will see that it begins to change, because as one set of cones in your eye wears out, another one will kick in, and the painting will completely change as you stare at it. And once again, these paintings are pretty big. They're about 5 by 5 feet. But that's the point. It takes you time to get into them, and you have to stare and watch how they transmogrify in front of your eyes as you stare at them, and the cones in your eyes wear out. I hope people are getting the phenomenon, even just from the slide. As I said, it's not this bright, really. I had a digitally enhanced version of the same painting, so you get the idea of what it's about. Value is lightness and darkness. You can see here this painting by Salvatore Rosa, very sardonic character he was. He was a contemporary, sort of a contemporary, a little later than Caravaggio and the other Italian Baroque painters. Caravaggio was a little earlier than him, but he was a real sardonic character. He was an actor and a playwright as well as a painter. To give you an idea of what his philosophy was, and the name of the painting is Philosophy, it's thought to be an idealized self-portrait. The little plaque he's holding in his hand says, "Unless what you have to say is better than silence, please remain silent." He was always in trouble with the authorities. He got kicked out of Rome once for 8 years because of a satire he wrote about the sculptor Bernini. So he was kind of a shady character, and the values of his painting kind of give that idea. And it's done very much on purpose for emotional effect, these very dark shadows. Here, on the other hand, you have Wayne Thiebaud, one of the very few happy artists out there, and the light value scheme, the kind of brighter colors give this painting a whole different feel. He painted a lot of bubblegum machines, a lot of desserts, things like that. And you can see what a difference the value shift makes. This painting looks so much happier, than this one does. Now, shape and form is the idea we were talking about before, where canvas is flat and we have the illusion of space. Here we have a circle. You put some shading on the circle, all of a sudden it looks round. You put a shadow behind it, all of a sudden it looks round like it's sitting on something. And shadows, the play of light and dark, is what makes a painting look three-dimensional and gives a feeling of space. This is a painting where it's all shapes that turn into forms, but there's no shadows. So the sense of space is very confusing. And like, whereas this here yellow thing looks like it's receding into space, you can look at it for a little while and then all of a sudden it turns flat and you realize it's not receding into space. It's just a trapezoid. This is just a parallelogram or kind of off parallelogram. And these shapes don't even really make sense. So Al Held in this very large painting, once again, is kind of asking what is three-dimensional and what's not three-dimensional and what's real space and what's not real space. But by leaving out any sense of shadows, maybe a little difference in coloring, he really makes this painting very confusing, gives us a lot to look at. Texture is the last thing we're going to look at. We are a little bit over, but we did start a little late, I think. So this is where we finish. Texture, once again, is that feeling of paint. This painting by Frank Auerbach is a portrait. And when we look at a detail, you can see just how much work there is in it. Some of his paintings were actually too heavy to hang on a wall because he put so much paint on them. And to keep this much color on a brush and to keep the colors clean really is quite an extraordinary feat. So this is a very painterly kind of texture. You'll hear that word a lot, painterly, meaning that the paint strokes really show. Then you have here by Donald Judd, a painting with no texture. And the reason is because he wanted these boxes called stacks that are just stacked evenly up on a wall, depending on how high your wall is, depending on how many boxes you put there. And they're evenly spaced, but it's all about the play of light and shadow on a sculptural thing. By using plexiglass and metal, there's no story, there's no, nothing to interpret. He made it purposely very industrial looking because he wanted just this sculpture to look different at different times of day and how it looks when the light is different. And that's all it's about, nothing else. So he purposely uses very smooth texture and these very industrial materials so that it wouldn't look too, you wouldn't read too much into it and try to get anything interpretive out of it. This, on the other hand, is called Single Gun Theory. It's a floor installation by Polly Applebaum, and it's made out of hand-dyed fabric. Now, Single Gun Theory refers to the Kennedy assassination, and I think, to my eye, this represents the trajectory of a bullet and an explosion, but it's made out of this very soft, very colorful material, so it's kind of a very weird juxtaposition. And this is another example of a real object where texture is actually on a surrealist object. This is Merritt Oppenheim's most famous surrealist object. She lined a teacup and a teaspoon and a tea plate with fur. And you can really, really feel that even without touching it. It just feels kind of ooky. And that's the thing about texture in art, is that it's usually perceived because you're not usually supposed to touch art. But here you really do get a feeling of texture from this fur-covered teacup. The idea of having hair in your mouth is a little uncomfortable. And she plays with that to a great extent. And this is an implied texture, once again, an Ang painting where it's so realistically painted that you feel the material. And once again, this is called implied texture, where you get the real feeling of a real thing by capturing, by making it so realistic that it feels almost real. And this is where we end, just showing you all the other types of art there are besides painting. So if I were to ever do this 6-hour version of this class again somewhere, I would get into all of these other types of art. And this is pretty much where we're going to end. I think I've talked very quickly and covered a lot of ground. So we have 200 people still here and a lot of chats. Should we open it up to questions? What do people have to say?
Absolutely, Gene. So wonderful job. And don't worry too much about the time.
Okay.
So folks,
I'm not worried about it. I'm not going anywhere today. I have a class to teach tonight and that's it.
All right. So folks, I will take questions and comments now. If you haven't already, feel free to get them into the chat and Q&A. Barbara says this talk is very accessible while covering so many detailed topics. It was very well done, and she's going to look forward to watching the recording. Patricia
Yeah, watch
says,
the recording because you'll probably miss a lot in the first time. So I'll bear repeating, hopefully.
yeah. Anne says this was fantastic. I loved every minute. Pam
Okay.
says, I loved the info and entertaining style of this presentation. I really needed it. Claudia wants to know about your 6-hour class. Is that available virtually? And how did she learn more about that?
The 6-hour art major is basically you go to art school in miniature. So this lecture is a longer version of the art appreciation section of that particular class. So 6-hour art major, we basically do some drawing exercises. We talk about art appreciation. There's a section on art history. So essentially it's art school in miniature. And you basically have the experience of quote unquote going to art school. I'm big with the air quotes today, aren't I? You go to art school in miniature so you can understand how to look at art better, sort of like here, because you've actually done it. You get a historical context. Nobody's offered, I think it's going to be offered somewhere in the future. I forget where. Somebody had talked about doing it. But as of now, I think that's still a maybe. So somebody has to offer it, or somebody can get a group together and offer it themselves. If you want to do that, that's a possibility as well. But I think I have one coming up. You could go to the6hourartmajor.com and look at my calendar. It would be listed.
Okay, so, and I think that's what Claudia was looking for. So the website address one more time, Gene?
The6hourartmajor.com. You can also get to that through my website, which is my name.
Yeah, I'll include those websites in the follow-up email I send everyone. Robin says, thank you so much, very interesting. Amy says, great presentation. Dory says, very informative. Jody says, excellent talk. I learned so much and would love to get your book. Gene, where can folks purchase a copy of your book?
It's all over the place. You just go online. I would suggest buying it from the publisher, or you can get on Amazon, any of those places. It's called The Art of Looking at Art.
Yeah. Cheryl says, thanks for opening my eyes. I loved this. Shinwei says, absolutely amazing presentation. I look forward to the next and the next. Thank you, and thank you to the Tewksbury Library. Jackie says, I hope I will see art very differently after attending. She found this excellent. Patricia says, fabulous, as does Claudia. Ellen says, in the black painting, how does the artist see the reds, blues, and greens while he's painting?
He painted, I think, very thin. I was going to find it, but maybe he painted very. But the thing is, what he would do, his method for doing this was to take some black paint and mix a certain amount of red, blue, or green into it, and then he would let it sit in a jar until the paint settled to the bottom and pour off the turpentine from the top. So he had this really thick, viscous paint, but he measured it in a jar. And I guess he just applied the paint until it looks right. And I'm sure he worked in excellent light. You have to also think about just even the dust factor in painting something like that, because it's so delicate.
Cheryl says this was excellent. She learned a lot and she hopes to see you again. Armine says, thank you for sharing your knowledge. It shows how much there is to know. It's astounding. Frank says, bravo, superb guide tour with great points on the scientific aspects of visual sense perception in art. I'm going to scroll back up to the start of the chat. Let me see here. Jeffrey says, fantastic, so interesting, great talk. Michelle asks, how deliberate are painters' choices? Do most of them simply learn through years of practicing their craft, then just do it? Or is it more trial and error? Is it natural talent? Perhaps more of a philosophical question than a technical one.
Okay, that's a lot. That's actually a lot of questions. You know what? I'm freezing. I'm going to turn off my AC. 1 second.
Sure, no problem.
It's right here. It's right next to me, so it blows right on me. There's no other choice, no other place to put it. Okay, talent. I do not use the word talent unless I'm talking about Picasso or Michelangelo, those ones that come along once every 100 years, like a Mozart or something. Those people are at a different level from the rest of us. As far as learning art, I I would say also that hard work pays off more than talent. That everybody has artistic talent. I think anybody can learn to draw reasonably well. It's all on a sliding scale. Just like some people are naturally athletic, some people are naturally artistic, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn it, at least to a certain degree. Every art you do is different. For instance, painting a self-portrait is a lot different from, like I just did a series of abstracted tarot cards. I did a whole series of those. And that's the first time I ever did a series where it was kind of predetermined images that I had to do something according to rules. And, you know, there was like the 4 seasons or the 7 deadly sins or something. So having an assignment was different from just, you know, doing non-representational piece where I put the paint on a canvas and, you know, so what I'm saying is that whatever kind of art you do, it's a different thought process. Painting what's in front of you is different from painting something off the top of your head, which is different from painting something that's an assignment, which is different from copying somebody else's work. It's all very different. And as you do more, Whistler said a very good thing, I think on the last point. He did a painting of fireworks. And got a really bad review from this critic named John Ruskin, who hated Whistler's work. This is in the 1800s. And he actually sued the critic for libel. And he won his case, but he was only awarded a farthing. So he wound up having to declare bankruptcy over it. But in the court trial, the prosecution said, well, how much are you charging for this painting? He said, I'm charging 25 guineas or whatever. He said, well, how long did you take to do it? He said, it took you about a day and a half. He says, you're charging 25 guineas for painting that took you a day and a half to do? He said, no, people are paying 25 guineas for the experience of a lifetime. In other words, you learn how to throw stuff away over time, what's important and what's not. And artists are always looking to get to the essence more and more and more. And that's another reason for abstract art, is getting to the essence of something rather than the appearance of it. Does that answer the question, I think? Yeah.
I think that more than answers the question. Absolutely.
I go on.
No, it's fine. Maureen says, wow, Gene, because of you, I will no longer pass by portrait paintings. I will now Google the person to find out who the person is in the portrait. Let me see. And then just some sort of in the moment comments from a few folks. But let me jump back to the Q&A. The Q&A box. Let's see. Oh boy. Okay, so an anonymous attendee says, I appreciate you showing so many artists and sculptors who are contemporary. Probably would not have looked at them without your guidance. Thank you. Ellen has a question. Do you happen to know if you can walk on the Oldenburg Bridge?
It's funny. That occurred to me when I was looking at the slide just today. I don't know if you can, but we can look that up. Let's see.
Anonymous attendee says, when appreciating art, how do you balance understanding historical and social context with your own emotional reactions?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? I thought I had it and then I realized I didn't have it.
Yeah.
So how do you balance the historical?
Yeah. So when appreciating art, how do you balance understanding historical and social context with your own emotional reactions?
Well, I mean, that's kind of my own prejudice, is like leaning things toward history, because a lot of people will say, oh, it's just about the painting itself and the aesthetics and how it was done or whatever. And I think it becomes a lot more interesting when you know the history. But you don't necessarily, quite frankly, I don't usually give opinions, but neoclassical painting is not my favorite. It's just a little stiff for my taste. So even though I don't like necessarily I appreciate that it takes a lot of work to paint these paintings and it clearly shows skill, but it's not my favorite kind of painting. But I can still understand how important it is. So I guess it's, there are certain artists I might think are more important than good. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to prejudice anybody too much. But I think they are kind of separate things. And I think you can appreciate the history while not necessarily liking the painting yourself, or vice versa. Maybe the painting you really like, but you don't like what it's about or something. So I think they are kind of separate things. And I think you can divorce, you can look at an artwork as an object. You can look at it as a historical document. You can look at it as an aesthetic. You can look at it in all different kinds of ways. So.
Let's start to wind it down here. We had a few questions on the portrait of Kitty Fisher. Ellen wanted to know if you happen to know the size of the portrait, and Virginia asked, is there a red face on the left side of the painting of Kitty? This, I think, was towards the middle of your talk.
Where is she? There she is. No, that's a curtain. There's a curtain there, but people have actually pointed that out before. You're not the first one to this thing here. People have seen a face in there, but I think it's just the fabric. I have never seen this particular portrait in person. I believe it's in London somewhere, but it's probably not that big. It's probably standard portrait size, maybe around 24 by 30 or something like that. I don't imagine it's huge. So there's kind of a standard in classical portraiture of you want the person to look like they're a comfortable distance away from you, as if you were talking to them. So portraits are usually a little smaller than life size. Classical.
Anonymous attendee says, I hear more and more about visual literacy for museum personnel. Is that a trend or is that a real discipline that we should develop?
I think by visual literacy, I guess they mean learning how to see things. But it seems to be a new thing, but clearly it's been given a lot of attention. So I guess it is a thing. But you can't tell how long anything is going to last in the art world. Really, I mean, the art world is so trendy and so of the moment. And something might seem vitally important. And artists, this is the thing about art too, it changes throughout the ages. Different time periods interpret the same artist different ways. So not only does a person judge an artist differently, a time period judges an artist differently. So there's no way of telling how long that's going to last, but I assume, to me, visual literacy just means learning how to look. And I think it seems to me that maybe the terminology is new more than the philosophy. I'm not really up on that though, so I can't really give a good answer to that. Sorry.
So Gene, let's wrap it there. There was a few questions we didn't get to, and there's a lot more positive praise of you in the chat, but I won't go reading all that. Let's give Gene a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. For those watching live, you'll receive an email from me tomorrow with a link to the recording, a link to a feedback survey, information about some other upcoming virtual art history programs. Also, my library is running a virtual adult summer reading program, and you do not have to live in or near Tewksbury to participate. So I'll have information on that as well. I encourage you, and you can win $10 gift certificates to some wonderful Tewksbury restaurants. But if you don't live in the area, you can also receive Barnes & Noble gift cards. So before I wrap it up, Gene, any last words?
Yes, you should appreciate your libraries. Libraries are vitally important to your community. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, that's a good note to end on.
Because of libraries, you got a free art class, and there's all kinds of other things they do too. So just remember how important your libraries are. Yeah. So thanks so much, Gene. Thanks for ending on that note. So folks, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and we'll see you soon at another future virtual program. Have a good one. Thank you. See you
again.
Bye, Gene.
Bye. Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.